Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. I record paranormal videos for a living. The last Ouija board video I made changed my life. Hey Reddit, I've been debating whether or not to share this, but I feel like I need to get it off my chest. I record paranormal videos for a living. It's fun, thrilling, and sometimes downright terrifying. But the last Ouija board video I made, it changed my life forever, and not in a good way. It started like any other video shoot. I have a decent following on YouTube, and my subscribers love the Ouija board stuff. They can't get enough of it. So I decided to do a special one in an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. It's one of those places that everyone in the area knows about, but no one dares to enter. The Johnson house. Supposedly, it's haunted by the spirits of the Johnson family, who died there in a murder-suicide back in the 80s. I grabbed my gear cameras, mics, and of course, my trusty Ouija board. My friend Mike came along to help with the shoot. He's been my go-to guy for these things. He's skeptical about the paranormal, but he loves the adrenaline rush. We arrived just before dusk, the sun setting behind the decrepit house, casting long shadows that seemed to beckon us inside. The house was even creepier in person. The windows were broken, the front door hung off its hinges, and the entire place smelled like mold and decay. We set up in what looked like the living room. Dust covered everything, and I could see old, faded family photos on the walls, giving me chills. We started the session around midnight, the supposed witching hour. Mike held the camera while I set up the Ouija board on an old, rickety table. The planchette moved almost immediately, spelling out nonsensical words. We laughed it off, thinking it was just nerves or the uneven surface of the table. But then things got weird. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath. The planchette started moving faster, spelling out words like murder, trapped, and evil. Mike's face turned pale, and I knew he wasn't pushing it. I wasn't either. Something was in that room with us. I asked for a name, and the board spelled out Elizabeth. I felt a chill run down my spine. Elizabeth Johnson was the youngest daughter of the Johnson family, the one who supposedly killed her parents and siblings before taking her own life. The planchette then spelled HELP. Suddenly, we heard a loud bang from upstairs, like something heavy being dropped. Mike and I froze. The camera caught everything, the sound, our terrified faces, and the planchette moving on its own. Mike whispered that we should leave, but I was determined to see it through. I asked Elizabeth what she needed help with. The planchette moved slowly, spelling out THEM. I asked who them was, but before I could get an answer, the temperature plummeted even further, and the lights on our cameras started flickering. Then we heard it. Faint, but unmistakable. The sound of a child crying. I felt like I was in a horror movie. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. My legs were like lead. Mike finally snapped out of it and grabbed my arm, pulling me towards the door. As we stumbled out of the house, the crying grew louder, more desperate. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. I thought that was the end of it, but things only got worse. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Elizabeth's face, twisted in agony. I heard her voice, whispering for help. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but the next morning, I found deep scratches on my arm, 3 parallel lines, like claw marks. Mike called me, frantic. He had the same scratches. We agreed to meet up and figure out what the hell was happening. But before we could, I got another call from the police. They found Mike's body in his apartment. The cause of death? Suicide. He had carved the word help into his chest before slitting his wrists. I was in shock. Mike was the last person I'd ever think would do something like that. He was always the rational one, the skeptic. I knew then that whatever we had encountered in that house wasn't done with us. I felt a presence in my own apartment, a cold, malevolent force that watched me, waiting. I threw away the Ouija board, deleted the footage, and tried to move on. But Elizabeth wouldn't let me. I saw her everywhere, in the mirror, in my dreams, standing at the foot of my bed, her eyes hollow and accusing. I started hearing whispers, begging me to help her, to free her from whatever was holding her captive. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. I started researching the Johnson family, trying to find out what happened, why Elizabeth was haunting me. What I discovered was far worse than I could have imagined. I'll post part 2 soon. I need to gather my thoughts and try to calm down. Just writing this out has my heart racing. If anyone has any advice or has experienced something similar, please let me know. I feel like I'm losing my mind. My research took me deep into the history of the Johnson family and the house they lived in. The more I dug, the more unsettling the story became. Elizabeth Johnson wasn't just a typical troubled teen. According to old news articles and police reports, she'd been obsessed with the occult, performing dark rituals and trying to summon spirits. Her diary, which was part of the police evidence, detailed her descent into madness. She believed something had attached itself to her, a malevolent entity that drove her to commit the murders. I spent hours poring over every scrap of information I could find. The house was built in the early 1900s and had a history of tragic events long before the Johnson family moved in. There were stories of previous owners experiencing strange phenomena, objects moving on their own, unexplained cold spots, and even sightings of shadowy figures. It seemed the place was cursed. Desperate for answers, I contacted a local historian who specialized in haunted locations. Her name was Margaret, and she agreed to meet me at a nearby cafe. She was an older woman with a calm demeanor and an air of authority. I showed her my research and she nodded gravely. "That house has been a blight on this town for over a century," she said. "It's built on land that was once a Native American burial ground. There are stories that the spirits of those who were wronged still linger, seeking vengeance." Margaret explained that the Johnson family had unknowingly tapped into something ancient and powerful. Elizabeth's rituals had likely awakened whatever dark force was tied to the land, and it had consumed her. "But why me?" I asked. "Why is Elizabeth haunting me?" Margaret looked me in the eye. "You opened a door that should have remained closed. Spirits like Elizabeth's are drawn to those who interact with the supernatural. You became a beacon for her and whatever entity tormented her. She suggested I seek out a spiritual medium, someone who could help communicate with Elizabeth and find out what she wanted." I was skeptical, but willing to try anything at this point. The nightmares were getting worse, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I found a medium named Claire through an online forum. She had a good reputation and seemed genuine. When I called her, she immediately agreed to help and asked me to bring anything related to the Johnson house. I packed up the few artifacts I had, old photos, newspaper clippings, and the Ouija board, which I had retrieved from the trash against my better judgment. Claire's home was filled with crystals, incense, and other spiritual paraphernalia. She greeted me warmly, though her eyes showed a hint of concern. We sat in her dimly lit living room, and she asked me to place the items on a small table. She lit some candles and incense, then closed her eyes and began to chant softly. The air grew heavy, and I felt a chill creep up my spine. Claire's chanting grew louder, more intense. Suddenly she gasped, and her eyes flew open, wide with fear. "She's here," she whispered. "Elizabeth is here." I felt a cold breeze brush past me, and the candles flickered wildly. Claire started speaking in a voice that wasn't her own, a young girl's voice filled with anguish. "Help me! He won't let me go." I asked who he was, and Claire's body tensed. "The darkness. He's everywhere. He's everything. He won't let us rest." Claire's voice returned to normal, and she looked at me, her face pale. "There's something else. Something much darker. Elizabeth is trapped by this entity, and it's feeding off her pain and fear. We need to find a way to break its hold." I asked how we could do that, and Claire suggested a cleansing ritual at the Johnson house. We needed to confront the entity and release Elizabeth's spirit. It sounded insane, but I was willing to do whatever it took to end this nightmare. We planned to meet at the house the next night. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see Elizabeth's face staring back at me. When I got home, I found the word help scratched into my front door. I barely slept that night, plagued by nightmares of Elizabeth's twisted face and the dark entity looming over her. I woke up drenched in sweat, the sound of her cries echoing in my ears. I knew we had to act fast. The next evening, I met Claire at the Johnson house. The place looked even more sinister in the moonlight, its broken windows like dark eyes watching us. We set up in the living room again, Claire arranging candles and herbs in a circle. She began chanting, and I felt the air grow colder. The planchette on the Ouija board moved on its own, spelling out DANGER. Claire's voice took on that eerie, childlike tone again. "He's here. He's angry." The temperature dropped further, and a foul smell filled the air. Shadows danced on the walls, and I felt a crushing weight on my chest. Claire continued chanting, her voice growing stronger. I joined in, repeating the words she had taught me. Suddenly, a deafening roar filled the room, and the shadows coalesced into a tall, dark figure with glowing red eyes. It reached out towards Claire, but she stood her ground, her chanting unwavering. I felt an intense pressure in my head, like it was going to explode. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, there was a blinding flash of light. The figure let out a blood-curdling scream and dissolved into the shadows. The room fell silent, and the oppressive weight lifted. Claire collapsed, exhausted, but smiling. "It's over," she said. "Elizabeth is free." I wanted to believe her, but something felt off. As we packed up to leave, I saw a reflection in the broken mirror on the wall. Elizabeth's face, watching me, her eyes filled with sorrow, and behind her, the faint outline of the dark figure still lurking in the shadows. Part 3 will be up soon. I need to gather my thoughts and try to make sense of everything. This isn't over. I can feel it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Even after the ritual, the sense of being watched, of something sinister lurking just out of sight, never left me. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, that Claire had successfully freed Elizabeth and banished the dark entity. But deep down, I knew better. The first sign that things were far from over came the next morning. I woke up to find my apartment in complete disarray. Furniture was overturned, picture frames were shattered, and the word help was scrawled in what looked like blood on my living room wall. I checked myself for injuries but found none. Whatever had done this had used something else's blood. I called Claire immediately, her calm voice over the phone offering little reassurance. She agreed to come over and take a look. When she arrived, she looked around my apartment with a grim expression. "This isn't over," she said. "The entity is still attached to you." We sat down, and Claire explained that sometimes, when a powerful spirit is disturbed, it can latch onto someone involved in the process. "It's using your fear and anxiety to strengthen its hold," she said. "We need to find a way to sever the connection." Claire suggested another ritual, this time to cleanse me personally. She needed some time to gather the necessary materials, so she told me to stay calm and try to maintain a positive mindset. Easier said than done when your apartment looks like a crime scene and a malevolent spirit is stalking you. The days that followed were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Elizabeth's face, her eyes wide with terror. The dark figure was always there, a looming presence that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. I heard whispers in the dead of night, disembodied voices calling my name, begging for help. I began to see things out of the corner of my eye, fleeting shadows, dark figures that vanished when I turned to look. I felt a constant, oppressive weight on my chest, making it hard to breathe. My friends noticed my erratic behavior and growing paranoia. They tried to help, but there was nothing they could do. The night before Claire's scheduled cleansing ritual, I experienced the most terrifying event yet. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I felt a cold hand wrap around my ankle. I jolted up, heart pounding, but nothing was there. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but then I felt it again. A cold, clammy hand, this time gripping my wrist. I screamed and jumped out of bed, turning on every light in the apartment. The air was freezing, and I could see my breath. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the corner of my bedroom. I turned slowly, my blood running cold. The dark figure was standing there, its red eyes glowing in the dim light. It moved closer, its form becoming more defined. I could see its twisted, grotesque features. A face contorted in a permanent snarl, sharp claws extending from its fingers. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even scream. The figure reached out, its hand inches from my face. Suddenly, a blinding light filled the room, and the figure recoiled, letting out a deafening screech. I shielded my eyes, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. The light faded, leaving me alone in the freezing room, my heart racing. Claire arrived early the next morning, sensing the urgency in my voice when I called her. She wasted no time setting up for the cleansing ritual, lighting candles and burning sage. She instructed me to sit in the center of a circle she had drawn on the floor with salt. Claire began chanting, her voice strong and steady. The air grew heavy, and I felt a familiar chill creep up my spine. I closed my eyes and focused on her voice, trying to block out the whispers and shadows that seemed to swirl around me. Suddenly, I felt a searing pain in my chest, like something was trying to tear its way out. I doubled over, clutching my chest as the pain intensified. Claire's chanting grew louder, more urgent. "You need to fight it!" she shouted. "Don't let it take you." I focused on her words, drawing on every ounce of strength I had left. The pain grew unbearable, and I felt like I was being torn apart from the inside. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the pain stopped. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. Claire knelt beside me, her face etched with concern. "It's done," she said. "You're free." I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the entity was still lurking, waiting for another opportunity to strike. As we packed up, I saw a shadow move out of the corner of my eye. When I turned, there was nothing there, but I knew it was watching. Part 4 is coming. I need some time to process everything. This fight isn't over, and I have a feeling the worst is yet to come. The days following the cleansing ritual were eerily calm. Claire insisted that the entity had been driven away, but I couldn't shake the lingering sense of dread. I went through the motions of daily life, trying to convince myself that it was over. Yet, deep down, I knew something was wrong. It started with the nightmares. Every night, without fail, I found myself back in the Johnson house. Elizabeth was there, but now she was joined by the dark figure, its red eyes glowing with malevolence. They would watch me, silent and still, as I tried to escape. But no matter where I ran, the house's walls would stretch and twist, trapping me within. One night, I woke up drenched in sweat, the whispers still echoing in my ears. I decided to check my emails, hoping to distract myself. Among the usual spam and fan messages, there was an email with no subject line. It was from an address I didn't recognize. I hesitated before opening it, but curiosity got the better of me. The email contained a single sentence. "You opened the door, now face the consequences." My heart raced as I stared at the screen. Who had sent this? And what did they mean by consequences? Before I could dwell on it further, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Claire. "We need to meet, urgent." We met at a small, secluded park. Claire looked more haggard than I'd ever seen her. She handed me a folder filled with old documents and photographs. "I did some more digging," she said. "The entity we're dealing with isn't just any spirit. It's a demon, and it's been feeding off the fear and suffering of everyone who's come into contact with it." I flipped through the documents. They detailed the history of the land, stories of previous owners who had experienced similar hauntings. One photo caught my eye, a grainy image of the Johnson family, taken just days before the murders. Elizabeth's eyes seemed to bore into me, pleading for help. Claire explained that the only way to truly banish the demon was to perform an exorcism. "But it's risky," she warned. If it goes wrong, the demon could become even more powerful. We need to be prepared for anything. We spent the next few days gathering supplies and preparing for the exorcism. Claire called in a favour from a priest she knew, Father O'Malley. He was an older man, his face lined with years of experience and a quiet strength. He agreed to help, though he made it clear that he wasn't entirely confident in our chances. The night of the exorcism, we returned to the Johnson house. The air was thick with tension, and I felt a familiar chill as we stepped inside. We set up in the living room again, Father O'Malley arranging holy water and crucifixes around the room. Claire lit candles and began chanting softly, her voice a steady anchor in the growing darkness. As the exorcism began, the temperature plummeted. The shadows on the walls seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing. The candles flickered, and the air grew thick with an oppressive, foul-smelling fog. Father O'Malley recited prayers, his voice strong and unwavering. Then the whispers started. They grew louder and more insistent, echoing off the walls. Elizabeth's face appeared in the mirror, her eyes wide with terror. "Help me," she mouthed, her voice barely audible over the chanting. The dark figure materialized, its red eyes glowing with hatred. It moved towards Father O'Malley, who stood his ground, holding up a crucifix. The demon let out a deafening roar, and the entire house shook. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. I joined Claire in chanting, my voice shaking but determined. The demon's focus shifted to me, its eyes boring into mine. I felt an intense pressure in my head, like it was going to explode, but I kept chanting, drawing strength from Claire and Father O'Malley's unwavering presence. The demon let out another roar, and the pressure intensified. I felt like I was being torn apart from the inside, but then I saw Elizabeth's face. Her eyes filled with determination. "You can do this," she seemed to say. "You have to." With a final, desperate effort, I shouted the last words of the exorcism. There was a blinding flash of light, and the demon let out a blood-curdling scream. The pressure lifted, and the shadows receded. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting. We collapsed to the floor, exhausted but alive. Claire looked at me, her face etched with relief. "It's over," she said. "The demon is gone." But as we packed up to leave, I caught a glimpse of the mirror. Elizabeth's face was still there, watching me. Her eyes were no longer filled with terror, but with sadness, and behind her, in the depths of the shadows, I saw the faint outline of the dark figure, its red eyes still glowing. Part 5 will come soon. I need to gather my thoughts and figure out what to do next. This isn't over, not by a long shot. The calm after the exorcism was deceptive. For a few days, I allowed myself to believe that the nightmare was finally over. Claire and Father O'Malley assured me that the demon was banished, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for another opportunity. Then the messages started. It began with a series of cryptic emails, all from anonymous senders. Each email contained a single line, like, "You can't hide," "It's not over," and "We are waiting." They were always sent in the dead of night, when I was most vulnerable. I tried to ignore them, but they gnawed at my sanity. One night, I woke to find my phone screen lit up with notifications. Someone had been sending me text messages, one after another. They were all the same. "Help me!" My heart raced as I scrolled through the messages. It was Elizabeth's voice in my head, pleading, desperate. The final message was different. It read, "It's coming for you." I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I turned on every light in my apartment, checking every corner, every shadow. But I was alone. The whispers began again, faint but unmistakable. I couldn't tell if they were real or just the echoes of my fraying mind. Desperate, I called Claire. She answered groggily, but listened patiently as I explained what was happening. She agreed to come over first thing in the morning. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room, the lights blaring, clutching a crucifix. Claire arrived early, looking exhausted but determined. She examined my phone, her face growing more concerned with each message she read. "This isn't a residual haunting," she said. "The demon is still trying to get to you. It's using Elizabeth to weaken you." We decided to visit Father O'Malley. He welcomed us into his small, cluttered office, and we explained the situation. He frowned, clearly troubled. "I had hoped the exorcism would be enough," he said. "But this entity is more powerful than we realized." Father O'Malley suggested one final desperate measure, a binding ritual. "If we can't banish it, we may be able to trap it," he explained. "But it will require great personal sacrifice." We prepared for the binding ritual that night. We returned to the Johnson house, the place where it all began. The air was thick with foreboding as we set up the necessary items: candles, holy water, and an ancient book of incantations. Father O'Malley explained that we needed to draw the demon out and trap it within a consecrated circle. The ritual began at midnight. Claire and Father O'Malley chanted in unison, their voices rising and falling in a rhythmic pattern. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath. Shadows began to coalesce, swirling around the room. Suddenly, the dark figure appeared, its red eyes burning with fury. It moved towards us, but Father O'Malley stood firm, his voice unwavering. The demon recoiled, hissing like a wounded animal. I joined the chanting, my voice trembling but determined. The shadows grew thicker, the room darker. Elizabeth's face appeared again, her eyes wide with fear. "Help me," she mouthed. The demon let out a deafening roar and lunged at me. I felt its cold, clammy hands wrap around my throat, choking the life out of me. Claire's chanting grew louder, more urgent. Father O'Malley splashed holy water at the demon, and it shrieked in pain, releasing its grip. I gasped for breath, my vision swimming. With a final, desperate effort, I shouted the last words of the binding ritual. There was a blinding flash of light, and the demon let out a blood-curdling scream. The shadows were sucked into the circle, the red eyes flickering out. The air grew still, and the oppressive weight lifted. We collapsed to the floor, exhausted but alive. Father O'Malley looked at me, his face etched with relief. "It's done," he said. "The demon is bound. It can no longer harm you." As we packed up to leave, I caught one last glimpse of the mirror. Elizabeth's face was still there, watching me. Her eyes were no longer filled with terror, but with a quiet sadness. "Thank you," she seemed to say, and behind her, in the depths of the shadows, I saw nothing. The red eyes were gone. I returned home, exhausted but hopeful. For the first time in weeks, I slept peacefully, free from nightmares and whispers. But I knew that my life would never be the same. The experience had changed me, left scars that would never fully heal. I've stopped recording paranormal videos. It's not worth the risk, not after everything that's happened. I still see shadows out of the corner of my eye, still hear whispers in the dead of night. But they're just memories now, echoes of a nightmare that nearly consumed me. If you ever feel the urge to dabble in the supernatural, to seek out the things that go bump in the night, remember my story. Some doors should remain closed, some spirits left undisturbed, because once you open that door, there's no telling what might come through. My friend made me face my biggest fear through the Ouija board and call Bloody Mary. I regret it. Hey Reddit, I need to get this off my chest. I've been carrying it around for too long, and I feel like it's eating me alive. I need to share my story, but I should warn you, it's not for the faint of heart. If you're easily scared or disturbed, maybe this isn't the post for you. But if you're curious and have the stomach for it, here it goes. I've always been a skeptic. Ghosts, demons, the supernatural, I thought it was all bullshit. My friend, Dave, on the other hand, was obsessed with that stuff. He was always dragging me into abandoned houses, making me watch horror movies, and talking about the latest creepypasta he'd found. It was all a joke to me, a way to kill time and have a few laughs, until that night. It was a Friday, and we were at Dave's place. Just a typical night, some beers, pizza, and video games. Out of nowhere, Dave pulls out this old, dusty Ouija board. I laughed, thinking it was another one of his pranks. He said he found it at a garage sale and thought it would be fun to try it out. I should have known better. We set it up on his living room floor, candles lit around us for atmosphere. I was still chuckling, thinking how stupid this all was. Dave was dead serious though. He started explaining the rules, how we had to be respectful, how we had to take it seriously. I was still rolling my eyes when we placed our fingers on the planchette. "Is there anyone here with us?" Dave asked. I snickered, expecting nothing to happen, but the planchette moved, just a tiny bit, but it moved. I accused Dave of pushing it, but he swore he wasn't. I didn't believe him, but I played along. The thing started to spell out answers, nothing too creepy at first, just random words that didn't make much sense. Then Dave asked, "What do you want from us?" The planchette slid to the letters, one by one, spelling out BLOOD. My stomach twisted, but I tried to shake it off. It was just a game, right? Dave's face had gone pale, but he was determined to keep going. He asked who we were talking to, and the planchette spelled out BLOODYMARY. I felt a chill run down my spine. Bloody Mary was one of those urban legends that always freaked me out as a kid. The idea of summoning her, of calling her name in front of a mirror, made me sick to my stomach. Dave knew that. He knew how much it scared me, and now he was grinning like a maniac. "Let's do it," he said, eyes wide with excitement. I tried to back out, but he wouldn't let me. He practically dragged me to the bathroom, the Ouija board still clutched in his hands. He turned off the lights, lit a single candle, and shoved me in front of the mirror. "Come on, man, this isn't funny," I said, my voice trembling. But Dave was relentless. He started chanting her name, "Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary," urging me to join in. I felt like I was going to puke, but I did it. I said her name 3 times, my voice barely more than a whisper. Nothing happened at first. We stood there in the dark, the candle flickering, our reflections staring back at us. I felt a bit of relief, thinking it was just another one of Dave's stupid pranks. But then, the temperature dropped. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest. I could see my breath in the dim light. Dave's reflection in the mirror started to change. His face twisted, contorted into a grotesque mask of pain and fear. Blood began to drip from his eyes, his mouth, his ears. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I turned to look at Dave, but he was standing there, normal, untouched. It was only in the mirror that he was being torn apart. Then I saw her. Standing behind Dave in the reflection was a woman, her face a twisted mess of blood and scars. Her eyes were black voids, her mouth a gaping maw of darkness. She reached out, her fingers like claws, and grabbed Dave's shoulders. He didn't seem to notice, but in the mirror, he was screaming, writhing in agony. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, watching this nightmare unfold. The woman, Bloody Mary, turned her gaze to me. I felt her eyes boring into my soul, felt her hatred, her rage. She mouthed something, but I couldn't make it out. Then she smiled, a sick, twisted smile that made my skin crawl. She reached out towards me, and I felt a searing pain in my chest. It was like she was ripping my heart out. Everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the bathroom floor, the candle extinguished, the Ouija board shattered. Dave was nowhere to be found. I called out for him, searched the entire house, but he was gone, just gone. I stumbled out into the night, my mind a whirl of terror and confusion. I didn't know what to do, so I ran. I ran all the way home, locked myself in my room, and tried to convince myself it was all a bad dream. But the nightmares haven't stopped. Every night I see her. Every night I feel that searing pain. And every morning there's blood on my pillow. I don't know what happened to Dave. I don't know what happened to me. But I know one thing for sure. I never should have messed with that Ouija board. I never should have called her name. I couldn't sleep for days after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, Bloody Mary, her twisted smile, and those black, empty eyes. It was like she was haunting my every waking moment and every nightmare. I started to avoid mirrors, afraid of what I might see. I even covered the one in my bathroom with a sheet, but it didn't help. My parents noticed something was off. They asked me if I was okay, but I couldn't tell them the truth. How could I explain what I saw, what I felt? They'd think I was crazy. I started making excuses, saying I was stressed about school or feeling sick. They bought it, but I could see the worry in their eyes. Then, things started to get worse. At first, it was just small stuff. Objects would move around in my room, books would fall off shelves, lights would flicker. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just my imagination or coincidence. But deep down, I knew something was very wrong. One night, about a week after Dave disappeared, I woke up to a noise. It was a faint scratching sound, like nails on a chalkboard. It was coming from the direction of my bathroom. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to get up and check. I opened the bathroom door and saw the sheet covering the mirror was torn to shreds. The mirror itself was covered in what looked like bloody handprints. I stumbled back, my stomach lurching, bile rising in my throat. Suddenly my phone rang. I jumped, nearly dropping it in my panic. It was an unknown number, but I answered it anyway, hoping for some kind of distraction. I wish I hadn't. The voice on the other end was distorted, a low, growling whisper. "She's coming for you," it said. "You can't escape." I hung up, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I felt like I was losing my mind. I didn't know what to do, so I called the only person I thought might believe me, Sarah, a mutual friend of Dave's and mine. She was into all that supernatural stuff too, maybe even more than Dave. She'd know what to do, right? Sarah answered on the third ring. She sounded groggy, like I'd woken her up. I explained everything in a rush, my words tumbling over each other. There was a long silence on the other end before she finally spoke. "Jake, you need to get out of the house," she said, her voice trembling. "Come over here. We'll figure something out." I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my keys and bolted out of the house, not bothering to pack anything. The drive to Sarah's was a blur. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Bloody Mary in the back seat. When I finally got to Sarah's, I practically fell into her arms, shaking like a leaf. We sat in her living room, the lights turned up bright, and she listened as I recounted everything that had happened. She didn't laugh, didn't call me crazy. Instead, she nodded, her face serious. "You've opened a door," she said, "and now something's come through. We need to close it." Sarah explained that Bloody Mary was more than just an urban legend. She was a malevolent spirit, drawn to fear and blood. By using the Ouija board and calling her name, we had invited her into our world, and now she was bound to me, feeding off my fear, my pain. "We need to perform a cleansing ritual," Sarah said. "It's the only way to send her back." I wasn't sure I believed her, but I was desperate. I'd do anything to make this stop. Sarah gathered some supplies, sage, candles, salt, and we headed back to my place. I was on edge the whole time, every shadow, every sound setting me off. When we got to my house, it felt different, colder, darker, like the very walls were closing in. Sarah lit the sage and started chanting, moving through the rooms, the smoke trailing behind her. I followed, clutching a candle, my heart in my throat. We reached the bathroom, the source of it all. The mirror still bore those bloody handprints, and I could see my breath misting in the air. Sarah began sprinkling salt around the room, her chants growing louder. I watched the mirror, my pulse racing. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the temperature dropped even further, and the lights flickered. The mirror started to fog up, words appearing in the condensation. "I see you," it read. I backed up, bumping into Sarah. She grabbed my hand, squeezing it tight. "Stay strong, Jake," she said. "We're almost done." But we weren't. The bathroom door slammed shut, and the room plunged into darkness. The candle went out, and I could hear a low, guttural laugh. I fumbled for my phone, using its light to see. In the mirror, Bloody Mary stood behind us, her eyes boring into mine. She reached out, her hand passing through the glass like it was water. I screamed, and Sarah started chanting louder, her voice frantic. The mirror began to crack, spiderwebbing out from where Bloody Mary's hand touched it. The temperature dropped so low I could feel frost forming on my skin. Suddenly, there was a blinding flash of light and a piercing scream that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The mirror shattered, the pieces flying across the room. Then, everything went silent. The temperature slowly returned to normal, and the oppressive feeling lifted. Sarah collapsed, panting, and I fell to my knees, shaking uncontrollably. The nightmare was over. At least, that's what I hoped. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. You don't just get rid of something like Bloody Mary. You don't just walk away unscathed. I looked at the shattered mirror, the broken pieces scattered around me. In one of the shards, I saw her face, just for a split second before it disappeared. She was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. And I knew, without a doubt, that this wasn't the end. I spent the next few days at Sarah's place. I couldn't bear to be alone in my house, and she insisted I stay until we figured out our next move. We were both exhausted, but Sarah seemed to know what she was doing, and I trusted her. She spent hours researching, poring over old books and websites, looking for anything that might help us. We were in her living room, surrounded by candles and stacks of old texts, when she found something that made her go pale. "Jake, look at this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She handed me a dusty book, open to a page with an illustration of a mirror covered in blood. The text was in some old language, but Sarah translated it for me. It spoke of a ritual, an ancient and dangerous one, that could banish spirits like Bloody Mary, but it required a blood sacrifice, a life for a life. My stomach churned at the thought, but what choice did I have? "Are you sure about this?" I asked, my voice shaking. Sarah nodded, her face grim. "It's the only way, Jake. We have to try." We spent the next day gathering the supplies we needed. Candles, herbs, a ceremonial knife. The book detailed every step, every chant. We couldn't afford to make a mistake. As night fell, we set everything up in Sarah's basement. It was the safest place, away from mirrors and reflective surfaces. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Sarah and I double-checked everything, then triple-checked it. We couldn't afford any errors. Finally, it was time. We lit the candles, the flickering light casting eerie shadows on the walls. The air was heavy with the scent of sage and other herbs. Sarah began the chant, her voice steady and strong. I followed her lead, reciting the words from the book. The air grew colder with each verse, the temperature plummeting until we could see our breath. I tried to focus on the ritual, but my mind kept drifting to the thought of what was to come. As we chanted, I felt a presence growing in the room. The shadows seemed to move, and the air felt thicker, like something was pressing down on us. I knew she was there, Bloody Mary, waiting for her moment. The book said the blood sacrifice had to be given willingly, the life offered to banish the spirit. I held the ceremonial knife, my hands trembling. Sarah looked at me, her eyes full of fear and determination. "It has to be you, Jake," she said softly. "She's bound to you." I nodded, swallowing hard. I steeled myself, took a deep breath, and sliced across my palm. The pain was sharp and immediate, blood welling up and dripping onto the floor. Sarah continued chanting, her voice growing louder, more urgent. The room seemed to darken, the shadows closing in. I felt dizzy, my vision blurring. I dropped to my knees, the knife slipping from my fingers. The candles flickered, the flames almost snuffed out by an unseen force. I could hear her laugh, a low, mocking sound that sent chills down my spine. Sarah grabbed my hand, smearing the blood on the floor in a pattern described in the book. The symbols glowed faintly, pulsing with an otherworldly light. The air grew colder still, frost forming on the walls. Suddenly, the shadows seemed to come alive. They coalesced into a form, a figure that stepped out of the darkness. It was her, Bloody Mary, her eyes black and empty, her mouth twisted into that horrifying smile. She reached out, her fingers like claws, and I felt a searing pain in my chest. I screamed, the pain overwhelming. Sarah's chants grew frantic, her voice shaking. The symbols on the floor flared bright and Bloody Mary hissed, recoiling from the light. I felt like I was being torn apart, my soul ripped from my body. Then there was a blinding flash. The light filled the room, driving the shadows back. I collapsed, gasping for breath, my body racked with pain. When I looked up, she was gone. The room was still, the air warm again. Sarah dropped beside me, her face pale and drawn. "Did it work?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She nodded slowly. "I think so. She's gone." I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I felt a lingering unease. We cleaned up the basement, extinguished the candles, and bandaged my hand. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. We sat in silence for a long time, neither of us knowing what to say. That night I slept for the first time in days. My dreams were dark and twisted, but she didn't appear. When I woke up, I felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe, just maybe, it was over. But the unease never left me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong, that she was still out there, watching, waiting. Sarah tried to reassure me, but I could see the doubt in her eyes too. A few days later, I was back at my house, trying to return to some semblance of normalcy. I was brushing my teeth, avoiding looking at the mirror, when I heard a faint whisper, "I see you." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I forced myself to look up, and there she was, just for a split second, reflected in the shards of the broken mirror. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I knew, with a sinking feeling of dread, that it wasn't over. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. The second I saw her face again, I grabbed my keys and bolted out of there. I didn't know where to go, but I couldn't be alone. I drove around aimlessly for hours, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do next. I ended up back at Sarah's place, pounding on her door like a madman. She opened it, looking worried and exhausted. I must have looked like a wreck. "Jake, what's wrong?" she asked. But she could see it in my eyes. She didn't need to ask. "She's still here," I said, my voice shaking. "We didn't get rid of her." Sarah let me in, and we sat down in her kitchen. She made some tea, her hands trembling as she poured the hot water. "There must be something we missed," she said, more to herself than to me. "There has to be another way." We spent the next few hours going through her books again, looking for any clue, any hint of what we could do. But it was like hitting a brick wall. Every solution we found pointed back to the same thing: a life for a life. My blood sacrifice hadn't been enough. Then Sarah had an idea. "Maybe we need to confront her directly," she said. "Not just try to banish her, but face her head on." The thought of facing Bloody Mary again made my blood run cold. But what choice did I have? If we didn't stop her, she'd keep haunting me until she drove me insane. Or worse. We decided to go back to my house. It was the last place I wanted to be, but it was where everything started, and maybe where it had to end. We arrived at my house just as the sun was setting. The place felt oppressive, like the air was thicker, heavier. We set up the living room with candles and the Ouija board, the same one that had started all this. Sarah had brought more supplies, herbs, salt, and a mirror she had covered with a black cloth. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. She nodded, though I could see the fear in her eyes. "It's our only shot, Jake. We need to be stronger than her. We need to show her we're not afraid." Easier said than done. We sat down on the floor, our fingers on the planchette. Sarah started the ritual, her voice steady despite the tension. "We call upon the spirit of Bloody Mary," she said. "We seek to face you, to end this torment." At first, nothing happened. The air grew colder, but there was no sign of her. Then the planchette started to move, slowly at first, then faster. "Hello, it spelled out. My heart was pounding in my chest. Sarah continued, her voice unwavering. "We demand you show yourself. We are not afraid." The candles flickered, the flames almost going out. The planchette moved again. YOUSHOULDBE, it spelled out. And then the temperature dropped so low we could see our breath. The black cloth over the mirror started to move, like something was trying to push through it. I felt a wave of nausea, the air thick with the scent of decay. Sarah stood up, chanting louder, more forcefully. "We banish you, Bloody Mary. We reject your power over us." The cloth was ripped away, and there she was, in the mirror. Her face was a mask of rage and pain, blood dripping from her eyes and mouth. She reached out, her fingers like claws, and I felt a searing pain in my chest, like before. Sarah didn't falter. She drew a circle of salt around us, her voice growing louder, more commanding. "You have no power here. You are not welcome." Bloody Mary let out a scream, a sound that pierced my ears and made my vision blur. She clawed at the mirror, trying to break through. I could feel her anger, her hatred. The mirror began to crack, just like it had in the basement. But this time, we were ready. Sarah threw herbs into the circle, the smoke rising and filling the room with a pungent smell. The mirror shattered, pieces flying everywhere, but none of them touched us. The room was filled with a blinding light, and I felt like I was being lifted, torn from reality. When the light faded, the mirror was gone. Nothing but shards on the floor. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifted. Sarah collapsed beside me, exhausted, but relieved. "Is it over?" I asked, my voice trembling. She nodded, though she looked as uncertain as I felt. "I think so." We cleaned up the mess, both of us too tired to say much. I spent the night at Sarah's again, unable to face my house alone. We both slept fitfully, plagued by dreams of Bloody Mary, but she didn't appear. The next morning, I went back to my house. It felt different, less threatening. I walked through each room, checking every mirror. There were no more handprints, no more whispers. Maybe, just maybe, we had done it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. As I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at my reflection, I thought I saw a flicker of movement, a shadow in the corner of my eye. I turned, but there was nothing there. For now, she was gone. But deep down, I knew she was still out there, waiting, watching. And I had to stay vigilant, because one day, she might come back. For the next few weeks, life started to feel almost normal again. I went back to my daily routine, trying to put the horrors behind me. Sarah and I kept in touch, checking in on each other. We were both trying to move on, but there was always that lingering sense of unease. I couldn't avoid mirrors forever, but every time I looked into one, I felt a shiver of fear. I kept expecting to see her, Bloody Mary, standing there watching me, but she didn't appear. Not in the mirrors, not in my dreams. I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, we had truly banished her. One night, I was out with some friends, trying to relax and have a good time. We ended up at a bar, laughing and drinking, the tension slowly easing from my shoulders. It felt good to be out, to feel normal. I even started to forget about Bloody Mary, if only for a little while. I went to the bathroom, feeling a bit more relaxed than I had in weeks. The bar was dimly lit, the mirrors smudged and dirty. I washed my hands, glanced up at my reflection, and froze. There, behind me, just for a split second, I saw her. Her face twisted in that horrific smile, her eyes black and empty. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. The bathroom was empty. I stumbled back, nearly slipping on the wet floor. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the door, bursting back into the bar, my mind reeling. I didn't tell my friends what I saw. I didn't want to believe it myself. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew she was still out there, watching, waiting. I went home that night, locking every door and window, drawing the curtains tight. I tried to sleep, but every creak, every whisper of wind outside sent me into a panic. I lay there in the dark, my mind racing until exhaustion finally took over. I woke up to a cold, damp feeling on my face. I opened my eyes and saw blood on my pillow. I sat up, my heart pounding, and looked around. My room was dark, the shadows deep and menacing. I could feel her presence, that oppressive weight in the air. I reached for my phone, the screen casting a faint glow. I needed to call Sarah, tell her what happened, but before I could dial, the phone slipped from my hands, the screen shattering on the floor. The air grew colder, my breath misting in the dark. I felt a presence behind me, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I turned slowly, my heart in my throat. She was there, standing at the foot of my bed, her eyes boring into mine. Bloody Mary. Her face was a mask of rage, her fingers twisted into claws. "You can't escape me," she whispered, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. "You belong to me now." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. She reached out, her fingers closing around my throat, the cold seeping into my skin. I felt like I was drowning, the air growing thick and heavy. "Please," I managed to choke out. "Leave me alone." She smiled, a cruel, twisted smile. Never. The room seemed to close in around me, the shadows wrapping me in their cold embrace. I could feel her breath on my skin, her presence overwhelming. I closed my eyes, praying for it to end, for her to go away. When I opened my eyes again, she was gone. The room was still, the air warm. I sat up, gasping for breath, my heart racing. I looked around, but there was no sign of her. But I knew she was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the house, not caring where I went. I ended up at Sarah's place, pounding on her door, tears streaming down my face. She let me in, her face pale with worry. "Jake, what's wrong?" she asked, but she could see it in my eyes. She didn't need to ask. "She's still here," I said, my voice trembling. "I can't get rid of her." Sarah hugged me, her arms tight around me. "We'll figure this out," she said. "We'll find a way." But as she said those words, I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I knew, deep down, that there was no escaping her. Bloody Mary would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. And no matter what we did, no matter how hard we tried, we could never truly banish her. She was a part of me now, a dark shadow that would haunt me for the rest of my life, and all I could do was try to live with it, knowing that one day she would come for me again. I called my dead friend through the Ouija board. He answered back, and he told me the worst secret. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural. Ghosts, spirits, and all that crap seemed like a load of nonsense made up to scare kids around a campfire. But what happened to me last month has changed everything. I can't sleep, I can't eat, and I feel like I'm losing my mind. I'm writing this to get it off my chest, but also as a warning. If you ever find yourself tempted to use a Ouija board, don't. Just don't. It all started a month ago when my best friend, Jake, died in a car accident. We'd been inseparable since we were kids. Losing him was like losing a part of myself. The funeral was gut-wrenching, and the days that followed were filled with a numbness I couldn't shake. Jake and I had always joked about the paranormal. We'd watch horror movies, make fun of ghost hunters on TV, and even played with a Ouija board once when we were drunk in college. It was a joke then, but after he died, I couldn't stop thinking about it. One night, after a few too many drinks, I found the old Ouija board buried in my closet. It was covered in dust, the planchette long forgotten at the bottom of the box. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I set it up on my coffee table. The house was silent except for the hum of the fridge. I lit a candle, more for atmosphere than anything else, and sat down. "Jake, are you there?" I asked, feeling like an idiot. I moved the planchette around the board, not really expecting anything to happen, but then it started to move. I thought I was imagining it, that maybe it was the booze or my grief playing tricks on me, but it moved again, more deliberately this time. Yes, I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. This had to be some kind of joke. "Jake, is it really you?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Yes." Tears filled my eyes. I didn't know what to say. 1,000 questions raced through my mind. Was he okay? Was he at peace? But the one that came out was, "What's it like?" Cold. I shivered. This was insane. "Are you alone?" I asked. "No. Who's with you?" I could barely breathe. "Him." "Who?" The planchette started to move more quickly, almost frantically. "Don't." "What do you mean, don't?" I was starting to panic. "Don't ask." The candle flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I jumped up, knocking the board off the table. The planchette skidded across the floor and disappeared under the couch. My heart was racing, and I was covered in a cold sweat. I fumbled for the light switch and turned it on, flooding the room with harsh light. The board lay face down on the carpet, and I could see the faint outline of letters burned into the wood. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't get the image of those letters out of my mind. Him. Who the hell was he talking about? Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I'd been drunk and grieving, and my mind had played a trick on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that something was in the house with me. Things started to go missing. At first, it was small stuff. My keys, a book, a pair of socks. But then, it was bigger things. My laptop, my wallet. I started to hear noises at night, footsteps in the hall, whispering voices. I thought I was going crazy. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom door open. I never sleep with it open. I got up to close it and saw a shadow move across the hallway. My heart stopped. I closed the door and locked it, but I could hear the whispering getting louder. The next morning, I found scratches on the inside of my bedroom door. Deep, angry gouges that hadn't been there the night before. I called a locksmith and had all the locks changed, but it didn't help. The feeling of being watched got worse. I started to see shadows out of the corner of my eye, fleeting glimpses of something just out of sight. One night, I was sitting in the living room, trying to distract myself with TV, when the lights flickered and went out. I heard a low, guttural growl from the hallway. My blood ran cold. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it down the hall, but there was nothing there. The growling continued, getting louder and closer. I backed into the living room, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Then, out of the darkness, I saw him. A figure stood at the end of the hall, tall and thin, with long bony fingers. His eyes were empty sockets, and his mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. He stepped forward, and I could see his skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones. He raised a hand and pointed at me, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. "You shouldn't have called him," a voice whispered in my ear. I spun around, but there was no one there. When I turned back, the figure was gone. The growling stopped, and the lights came back on. I fell to my knees, shaking and crying. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay in the house, but I had nowhere else to go. I packed a bag and went to stay with my parents, but even there, I couldn't escape. I woke up one night to find scratches on the walls of my old bedroom. The whispering followed me wherever I went. I was trapped. I knew I had to get rid of the Ouija board, but every time I tried to throw it away, it would turn up somewhere else. In my car, in my suitcase, even under my pillow. It was like it was haunting me. I did some research online and found a priest who said he could help. I drove 3 hours to see him, the board wrapped in a blanket in the trunk of my car. The priest took one look at it and shook his head. "This is very dangerous," he said. "You should never have used it alone." He performed a ritual to cleanse the board and told me to bury it in a place where no one would find it. I drove out to the middle of nowhere and buried it deep in the ground. I thought it was over, but the nightmares have only gotten worse. I see the figure every night, standing at the foot of my bed, his empty eyes staring into my soul. I hear Jake's voice, pleading with me to help him, but I don't know how. I don't know what to do. All I know is that I'm not alone, and I'm terrified of what's coming next. Don't use a Ouija board. It's not a game, it's a doorway, and once it's open, you can't close it. The nightmares got worse after burying the Ouija board. Every night I'd wake up in a cold sweat. The image of that skeletal figure burned into my mind. His empty eyes and twisted smile haunted me, but it was Jake's voice that broke me. He sounded scared, desperate, and I felt utterly powerless. I decided to confide in my friend Sarah. She was the only one who might believe me, having an interest in the paranormal herself. We met at a coffee shop, and I told her everything. She listened intently, her face growing paler with each detail. "We need to cleanse your house," she said, her voice firm. "There's something there, something that shouldn't be. I know a guy who can help. He's a medium, and he's dealt with things like this before." That night, Sarah and I drove to the medium's house. He was an older man, with a kind face and tired eyes. His name was Thomas. He listened as I recounted the events, nodding occasionally. "You've opened a door," he said finally, "and something has come through. It's attached itself to you because of your friend. When you called him, you called something else as well." He agreed to come to my house the next day. The drive back was tense. Sarah tried to reassure me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. That night I barely slept, haunted by the thought of what was to come. Thomas arrived the next morning, carrying a bag filled with candles, herbs, and other ritualistic items. He walked through the house, stopping occasionally to close his eyes and murmur something under his breath. Finally, he turned to me. "We'll start in the living room," he said. "This is where you used the board, right?" I nodded, my stomach in knots. Thomas set up candles in a circle and lit them, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. He sprinkled salt and herbs around the room, muttering incantations I didn't understand. As the ritual began, the temperature in the room dropped. I could see my breath in the air, and the candles flickered violently. Thomas continued his chants, his voice growing louder and more urgent. Suddenly, the flames of the candles flared up, and I heard a loud crash from the hallway. Sarah screamed. I spun around to see the tall, skeletal figure standing in the doorway, his empty eyes fixed on me. He stepped into the room, and the temperature plummeted further. I could feel a suffocating pressure in my chest, like I was being crushed. Thomas shouted something in a language I didn't understand, and the figure hissed, recoiling slightly, but he didn't disappear. Instead, he turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Thomas. With a guttural growl, he lunged at the medium. Thomas was thrown across the room, slamming into the wall with a sickening thud. The candles went out, plunging us into darkness. I could hear Sarah sobbing, and I stumbled towards her, my heart racing. "We have to get out of here," I yelled, grabbing her arm. We ran towards the front door, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like something was holding it shut from the other side. Desperate, I kicked at it, but it was no use. The whispering started again, surrounding us. I could feel something cold and clammy brush against my neck, and I spun around, but there was nothing there. Sarah was hyperventilating, and I could barely think straight. Thomas groaned from the corner of the room. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, but he struggled to his feet. "We need to finish the ritual," he said, his voice weak but determined. "It's the only way." I nodded, not knowing what else to do. We helped Thomas back to the circle, and he relit the candles with shaking hands. The figure reappeared, standing just outside the circle of light, watching us with those empty eyes. Thomas resumed his chanting, his voice trembling. The air grew colder, and the pressure in my chest intensified. The figure hissed again, but this time it seemed to waver, its form flickering like a bad signal. Suddenly, the planchette from the Ouija board shot across the room, hitting Thomas in the chest. He gasped, clutching it as if it burned. The figure let out an ear-piercing screech, and the lights in the house exploded, showering us in sparks. In the chaos, I saw Jake. He stood behind the figure, his face contorted in pain. He reached out to me, his mouth moving silently. I could see the terror in his eyes, and I knew he was trapped, caught between our world and whatever hellish place this figure had come from. Thomas screamed something in a language I didn't recognize, and the figure lunged at him again. But this time, there was a flash of light and the figure disintegrated, its form dissolving into smoke. The pressure lifted, and the temperature in the room returned to normal. We collapsed, gasping for breath. The candles burned brightly, and the oppressive darkness was gone. Thomas lay on the floor, the planchette still clutched in his hand. "It's over," he whispered. "For now." But I knew it wasn't. Jake was still out there, trapped. And whatever I'd unleashed, it wasn't gone. Not completely. I could feel it, lurking just out of sight, waiting. And I knew it was only a matter of time before it came back. After that night, nothing felt the same. The house was quieter, but the silence was more oppressive. It felt like a ticking time bomb, waiting for the next explosion of terror. Sarah insisted I stay with her for a while, and I didn't argue. I couldn't bear to be alone, not with the memories of that skeletal figure and the sight of Jake's tortured face haunting me. Sarah's apartment was small but cozy, a stark contrast to the icy, oppressive atmosphere that had taken over my house. We tried to go back to normal, but the shadows of that night lingered. Thomas had given us a temporary reprieve, but I knew it wasn't over. One evening, a few days after the ritual, Sarah and I sat in her living room, trying to distract ourselves with a movie. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of the TV casting flickering shadows on the walls. I was trying to lose myself in the plot when my phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was an unknown number, but something compelled me to answer. "Hello?" I said cautiously. A raspy, broken voice came through the line. "You shouldn't have called him." I felt my blood turn to ice. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my heart pounding. Sarah noticed my reaction and paused the movie. "What's wrong?" she asked, her eyes wide with concern. I told her about the call, and her face paled. "We need to talk to Thomas," she said firmly. "Now." We drove to Thomas's house, the darkness outside pressing in on us. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every flicker of light a reminder of the horrors we'd faced. When we arrived, Thomas looked worse than before. He was pale, and the cut on his forehead was bandaged, but he welcomed us in. "I've been expecting you," he said, his voice weary. "I did some research after you left. What you're dealing with is more powerful than I thought." He led us to his study, a small room filled with books and strange artifacts. He pulled out an old leather-bound book and opened it to a page filled with ancient symbols and illustrations. "This is a demonic entity known as the Watcher. It preys on those who are grieving, using their pain to enter our world. When you called your friend, you inadvertently called it as well." I felt a wave of nausea. "What can we do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Thomas sighed. "The ritual we performed weakened it, but it's still attached to you. We need to sever the connection completely, and that means confronting it directly. There's a way, but it's dangerous." He explained that we needed to perform another ritual, one that would require us to enter a state of deep meditation to confront the Watcher in its own realm. It sounded insane, but I was desperate. I couldn't go on living in fear, and I couldn't leave Jake trapped with that thing. The next night, we prepared for the ritual. Thomas instructed us to create a protective circle with candles and salt, and we each held a small piece of obsidian to ward off negative energy. He began chanting, his voice low and rhythmic, guiding us into a trance-like state. As the room around me faded, I felt myself being pulled into a dark, swirling void. The air was cold and thick, making it hard to breathe. I could see Sarah and Thomas beside me, their forms shimmering like ghosts. In the distance, a dim light flickered, and I knew we had to follow it. We moved through the darkness, the light growing brighter with each step. Suddenly, we were standing in a vast, empty space, illuminated by an eerie, otherworldly glow. In the center of the room stood the Watcher, its skeletal form towering over us, its empty eyes fixed on me. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed, its voice echoing in the void. Thomas stepped forward, holding out his obsidian. "We're here to end this," he said, his voice strong and commanding. The Watcher laughed, a horrible, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "You think you can defeat me?" it sneered. "I am eternal. I am darkness. You are nothing." Thomas began chanting again, his voice rising in intensity. The Watcher screamed, a sound so piercing it felt like my ears were bleeding. The ground beneath us shook, and I struggled to stay on my feet. I could feel the entity's rage, its power surging around us like a storm. Sarah grabbed my hand, her grip tight. "Focus," she whispered. "We can do this." I closed my eyes, concentrating on Thomas's chants. The darkness pressed in on me, but I pushed back, imagining a barrier of light surrounding us. I felt a warmth spread through me, a counter to the Watcher's icy presence. The entity screamed again, but this time its form wavered. Thomas's chanting grew louder, more forceful, and I felt a surge of energy. The Watcher's image flickered, its skeletal form breaking apart like shattered glass. With one final ear-splitting scream, it disintegrated, the darkness around us dissolving into nothingness. We were back in Thomas's study, the candles burning brightly. I collapsed, exhausted and shaking, but the oppressive feeling was gone. The house felt lighter, the air clearer. "It's over," Thomas said, his voice hoarse. "The connection is severed." Relief washed over me, but I couldn't shake the image of Jake's face. "What about Jake?" I asked, my voice trembling. Thomas sighed. "His spirit is free now. He's at peace." I wanted to believe him, but a part of me still felt uneasy. The Watcher was gone, but the scars it left behind would take longer to heal. We thanked Thomas and left, the weight of our ordeal still heavy on our shoulders. Back at Sarah's apartment, we sat in silence, trying to process everything. The nightmares had stopped, and the whispering was gone, but the memory of what we'd faced lingered. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to normal. I moved back into my house, the atmosphere no longer oppressive, but every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of a shadow out of the corner of my eye, or hear a faint whisper in the night, and I'd wonder if it was truly over, or if the Watcher was still out there, waiting for another chance to return. A few months passed, and though things seemed to settle, the trauma of what had happened never fully left me. I tried to return to my routine, but I was always on edge, waiting for the next wave of terror. It was like living in a haunted house that had been temporarily exorcised, knowing deep down that the malevolence could return at any moment. Sarah stayed with me often, her presence a comfort. We never spoke about what happened that night in Thomas's study, but the memory lingered between us like an unspoken pact. Then, one night, the peace shattered. I was lying in bed, drifting off to sleep, when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. My heart raced as I strained to listen. "Help me!" Jake's voice. I bolted upright, my body covered in a cold sweat. The room was dark, but the whisper continued, growing louder. "Help me!" I stumbled out of bed, my legs shaking. I followed the voice down the hallway, my pulse pounding in my ears. It led me to the basement door, which was slightly ajar. I hesitated, fear gripping me, but I couldn't ignore Jake's pleas. The basement was pitch black, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. I fumbled for the light switch, but it didn't work. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. "Help me!" I grabbed a flashlight from a nearby shelf and switched it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The light revealed the dusty old furniture, cobwebs hanging in the corners, and the concrete floor stained with years of neglect. My heart pounded as I descended the stairs, the flashlight shaking in my hand. At the bottom of the stairs, the voice stopped. I swept the flashlight around, looking for any sign of Jake, but there was nothing, just silence and darkness. I was about to turn back when I saw it, a small wooden box, half buried under a pile of old blankets. I pulled the box out, my hands trembling. It was locked, but the wood was old and brittle. I pried it open, and inside I found a stack of photographs and a journal. The photos were of Jake and me, from when we were kids up until a few years ago. We looked so happy, so carefree. Tears filled my eyes as I flipped through them. Then I opened the journal. The entries were written in Jake's handwriting, detailing his thoughts and experiences. As I read, my heart sank. Jake had been dealing with something dark, something he never told me about. The last entry was dated a week before his death. Something is following me. I see it in my dreams, and I feel it when I'm awake. It's always there, watching. I don't know how to stop it. I'm scared. If anything happens to me, tell my name. I'm sorry. I collapsed onto the floor, the journal falling from my hands. Jake had been haunted by the Watcher long before I ever used the Ouija board. This thing had latched onto him, feeding off his fear and despair. And now, it was after me. The whispering started again, louder this time. Help! Me! I grabbed the journal and the photos and ran back upstairs. Slamming the basement door behind me, I called Sarah, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. She answered on the second ring, her voice groggy with sleep. Sarah, it's back, I whispered, my voice trembling. I heard Jake. He's in the basement. Sarah was at my house within minutes. We sat in the living room, the journal and photos spread out on the coffee table. I told her everything, and she listened, her face growing paler with each word. We need Thomas, she said finally. We need to find out what this thing wants and how to stop it for good. We drove to Thomas's house, the night air heavy with tension. When we arrived, Thomas looked even more worn than before, but he let us in without question. We showed him the journal and told him about the whispering. This isn't over, Thomas said, his voice grim. The Watcher is still attached to Jake's spirit. It's using his connection to you to stay in our world. We need to find a way to sever that connection completely. Thomas explained that we would need to perform a final ritual, one that would require confronting the Watcher in its true form. It was risky, but it was our only hope. We agreed, knowing there was no other choice. The next night, we gathered in my living room. Thomas set up a circle of candles and salt, just as before. But this time, the air was thick with anticipation. We each held a piece of obsidian, and Thomas began chanting, guiding us into that familiar trance-like state. The darkness enveloped us, and we found ourselves in the void once more. The cold was more intense this time, the air thicker and harder to breathe. We followed the faint light, and soon, the Watcher appeared, more menacing than ever. You cannot defeat me, it hissed, its voice reverberating through the void. I am eternal. You are nothing. Thomas stepped forward, his face set with determination. We're here to free Jake, he said, his voice strong. You will release him, and you will return to where you came from. The Watcher laughed, a horrible, echoing sound. You think you can command me? It sneered. I will consume you all. The ground shook, and the darkness pressed in on us. I could feel the entity's power, a suffocating force that threatened to crush us. But then, I saw Jake. He stood behind the Watcher, his eyes filled with fear and desperation. Jake! I cried out, reaching for him. I'm here! We're going to help you! Jake's form flickered, and he took a step forward. The Watcher screamed, its skeletal form shuddering. No! He is mine! Thomas raised his obsidian, chanting louder and faster. The light around us grew brighter, pushing back the darkness. The Watcher howled in rage, its form breaking apart. I could feel its grip on us weakening. Jake reached out to me, his hand trembling. Please, help me, he whispered. I grabbed his hand, the cold seeping into my bones. I've got you, I said, my voice steady. You're coming home. The Watcher let out one final ear-splitting scream, and its form shattered, dissolving into nothingness. The void around us collapsed, and we were back in my living room, the candles burning brightly. Jake's spirit stood before us, his face peaceful for the first time in months. Thank you, he said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. I can rest now. He faded away, a smile on his lips, and the oppressive feeling lifted. The house felt lighter, the air clearer. The Watcher was gone, and Jake was finally at peace. We sat in silence, the weight of what we'd accomplished sinking in. Thomas looked exhausted but relieved. It's over, he said. For good this time. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. Thank you, I whispered, my heart aching with a mix of sorrow and relief. Life slowly returned to normal. The nightmares stopped, and the whispering was gone. But I knew I would never forget what we'd faced, and the bond between Sarah and I grew stronger. We'd faced the darkness and won, but the scars would remain, a reminder of the price we paid to bring Jake home. Months passed, and the days began to feel normal again. The terror that had engulfed my life started to fade into a distant memory. But even as the mundane rhythm of life returned, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. It was subtle at first. Small things that could easily be dismissed as paranoia. A cold spot in the room. A faint whisper that could have been the wind. Shadows that seemed a bit too dark. I chalked it up to residual fear, convinced that the worst was behind me. Sarah and I remained close, our shared ordeal forging an unbreakable bond. We spent countless nights talking, trying to make sense of everything. But one night, as we sat in my living room with a bottle of wine, something changed. We were reminiscing about Jake, sharing stories and laughing, when the room suddenly grew cold. The lights flickered, and the atmosphere became heavy, oppressive. I felt a chill run down my spine, and Sarah's laughter died in her throat. We exchanged a glance, both of us feeling the shift. "Do you feel that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, my heart pounding. The air grew colder, and the lights flickered again. Suddenly, the TV turned on by itself, the screen filled with static. A low, guttural growl echoed through the room, sending a wave of fear crashing over us. I grabbed Sarah's hand, my mind racing. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. We bolted for the front door, but it slammed shut before we could reach it. The growling grew louder, and the temperature continued to drop. Desperate, I reached for my phone to call Thomas, but the signal was dead. The growling turned into a whisper, a voice that seemed to come from all directions at once. "You can't escape me." It was the Watcher. Somehow, it was back. Panic surged through me as I realized the entity had not been fully defeated. It had been lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. Sarah and I clung to each other, our breaths visible in the icy air. The shadows in the room began to move, coalescing into the familiar, skeletal form of the Watcher. Its empty eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and its twisted smile sent a shiver down my spine. "You thought you could banish me?" it hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "I am eternal. I am darkness. You will never be free." Thomas had warned us of the risks, but I hadn't truly understood the depth of the Watcher's power. It wasn't just attached to Jake. It had found a way to latch onto me as well. I had to fight the rising panic and think of a way to survive this. I remembered the obsidian Thomas had given us. I still had mine, kept in a drawer for safekeeping. I darted towards the kitchen, Sarah following close behind. The Watcher's laughter echoed through the house, mocking our efforts. "You cannot escape," it taunted. "You are mine." I yanked open the drawer and grabbed the obsidian, holding it tightly in my hand. Sarah did the same, her face pale but determined. We turned to face the Watcher, the stones our only protection. Thomas had said that obsidian could ward off negative energy, but I wasn't sure how to use it to defeat an entity as powerful as the Watcher. Desperation gave me clarity, and I remembered the chants Thomas had taught us. I began to recite them, my voice shaking, but growing stronger with each word. Sarah joined in, our voices blending into a rhythmic chant. The Watcher screamed, its form flickering like a bad signal. The air grew colder, the pressure in the room almost unbearable, but we kept chanting, focusing all our energy on the obsidian stones. The Watcher's form began to waver, its eyes glowing with rage. "You cannot defeat me!" it howled, but there was a note of fear in its voice now. "I am eternal!" We continued the chant, our voices rising in strength and conviction. The obsidian stones glowed with an eerie light, and I felt a surge of energy pass through me. The Watcher screamed again, its form shattering into fragments of darkness. With a final ear-piercing shriek, the Watcher disintegrated, the darkness dissolving into nothingness. The room grew warm again, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. We collapsed onto the floor, exhausted but relieved. "It's over," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "It's really over." Sarah nodded, her expression a mix of exhaustion and relief. "We did it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. In the days that followed, I sought out Thomas to thank him and to ensure that the Watcher was truly gone. He confirmed that the entity had been banished for good, but he warned me to remain vigilant. These things have a way of finding their way back, he said, but you've proven you have the strength to fight it. Life slowly returned to normal. The house felt lighter, and the oppressive sense of dread was gone. Sarah and I continued to stay close, our bond strengthened by the horrors we had faced together. We knew that the darkness was always out there, waiting, but we also knew that we had the strength to face it. As I write this, I feel a sense of closure. The Watcher is gone, and Jake is at peace. The scars remain, but they are a reminder of the strength it took to overcome the darkness. And though I will never forget the terror we faced, I am finally able to move forward, free from the shadows of the past.